This is a video response to Ire Myth Per, also known as NuclearNights. In this video, hopefully I'll be able to highlight and correct many of her overt errors, non-sequiturs, hasty generalizations, and to illustrate the utter irrationality of her all-too-apparent male malevolency bias. Her video starts off as follows. NuclearNight says that she went to a workshop at an anarchist book fair. Kinda odd for a Marxist, but whatever. She says that she was one of the people leading this particular workshop. The topic of sexual boundaries was apparently brought up at the workshop. In her video, she then said that she referred to herself at the workshop as a survivor of sexual abuse. She then describes, after the fact, that she was abused at the workshop. She never clarified this, but how she subsequently describes events makes it seem that this abuse is basically equivalent to men asking questions. Anyway, apparently, during this workshop, a man in the audience asked her if she could give a specific example of one of her personal boundaries, and how such a boundary could be violated. Here's where she starts to go deeply off the rails. NuclearNight says that her first thought in response to his question was a desire to ask the man if he would get off or get some sort of sexual stimulation from her description of violating a personal boundary. Although it appears she didn't state this publicly. Apparently, just asking questions about boundaries in a relationship and describing a circumstance where such boundaries were crossed is a sign of sexual deviance. Apparently, NuclearNight's boundary is that no one can ask her about her boundaries, thereby making communication on the topic impossible, which is awesome. NuclearNight then illustrates how she jumped to this thought. Apparently, according to her, some people get off to stories of abuse. She then warns us that you have to look out for these sorts of people everywhere. Apparently, male rapists, perverts, and sadists are just lurking behind every corner. She gives absolutely no sound justification for this thinking, mind you. She merely asserts it, which is awesome. This is her first instance of foundationless thinking in her video, and the first sign of a male malevolency bias. Moving on. Next, NuclearNight has a talk with a group of women who were involved at the workshop. She subsequently proceeds to assert that the man who asked the questions about boundaries does the following. He, quote, collects information about feminism, reads feminist literature, listens to what feminists say, and does feminist workshops only in order to more easily manipulate women into bed. She also jumps to the conclusion that this man also does this to find new ways of abusing women, and that this is apparently a widespread phenomenon. Oh, and here's the best part. How did she justify this drastic claim? She had a discussion with her fellow feminists about it at the workshop, and they all agreed. Groupthink for the fucking win. Because, I mean, who needs evidence and sound reasoning when you just get everybody to agree? Let's recap this reasoning for a minute. Premise 1. Man at a feminist workshop asks for a personalized description of boundaries in a relationship and an example of crossing them. Conclusion. Therefore, it follows that this man, 1. Gets off to stories about female abuse, and 2. Learns about feminism and goes to feminist workshops in order to more effectively manipulate, seduce, and abuse women. I didn't realize this is Non-Sequitur Wednesday. Even if she was correct in every single one of her assertions of malevolence about this guy, it does not follow from her reasoning. This is yet another example of her systematic bias against males. Later, NuclearNight states that she has apparently lost many men important to her in her life because she was naive and didn't realize that this was the type of men they were. Her earlier statements make one wonder about her ability to assess the character of men, since she seems to have an all-too-apparent malevolency bias concerning them. She then says, quite ironically, quote, "A lot of human relationships are projection. We project our desires onto people, and sometimes we don't see the real them." My thoughts exactly. She seems to be doing a fine job of projecting malevolent thoughts onto the men she encounters, and from this, jumping to all sorts of fantastical conclusions. NuclearNight then moves on to say that she thinks it's one of the most horrible things imaginable for men to watch her videos and use her words to abuse and rape other women. She also says that she somehow knows that men who are currently watching her videos are doing this. How does she know this, you may wonder? Does she justify her assertion in any way whatsoever? No, because justifications, man, they really get in the way of just making shit up to serve your own political agenda. Next, she talks to her illusionary, women-abusing, YouTube-watching boogeyman she's just invented. And she says, quote, "We are jokes to you. Our reproductive organs are jokes, our bodily functions are jokes, our minds are jokes, our reality is a joke, our psychology is a joke. You don't think of us as being anything more than objects." She then points out how despicable she thinks men are who use the rhetoric of her movement against feminists. Oh, and it gets better. NuclearNight then says that she doesn't find feminist men, or even pro-feminist men, to be allies. She then makes the unfalsifiable assertion that it is not even possible for men to be a true ally when men have the ability to opt into their male privilege at any point. Negative form of the no true Scotsman fallacy for the win. She then goes on to assert, quote, "You," meaning men, you'll suspend it. You'll suspend your beliefs at any point just to get laid. I mean, really, men have no ethical values. Isn't it just fun when the burden of proof for a given proposition is met with whatever you happen to make up on the spot? I mean, really, who wants to go through the long, arduous process of trying to justify and offer evidence for claims that one makes? It's just so much easier to assert things that complement your own political agenda, so why do otherwise? Wait, no. Actually, the burden of proof is on the person making the claim, which in this case, any objective observer can clearly say it was not met, since NuclearNight didn't even attempt to justify her claim. Oh, and the last bit is my personal favorite. Nuclear talks about the idea that feminists want to shame men about their sexuality. She says, quote, "Shouldn't men be ashamed that so many men abuse women? Why shouldn't the fact that men abuse women be a source of shame for men? Men are allowed to get away with abuse, and people defend you. Like you shouldn't be ashamed." You know, that's really interesting, because I recall a time when feminists were in the business of convincing women not to be ashamed of their sexuality. This was because, said the feminists, that the reason for their shame, the Christian dogma entailing that women were responsible for original sin, was bullshit, and that shame was psychologically unhealthy and shouldn't be accepted due to fucking bullshit. But now that it's advantageous, hey, why not act like a hypocrite and try to make men ashamed of their sexuality with bullshit? After all, why shouldn't all men, many of whom have never abused women, feel shame for something they were not responsible for at all? Wait a minute. By that logic, women who have never abused men should feel guilty for the 40% of female aggression towards men that women commit. Women should also feel guilty for being aggressors in 71% of all non-reciprocal partner violence and violent relationships. And unlike someone, I'll provide links to these studies in the video description. By NuclearNight's logic, if a woman's great-great-great-great-great-grandmother killed an innocent child, they should feel ashamed, because people are totally responsible for something they had nothing to do with, just because someone arbitrarily fits in the same biological category. The implication of NuclearNight's rhetorical question is a classic example of the guilt by association fallacy. From the fact that one happens to be male, it does not follow that this person in question was the cause or shares any responsibility whatsoever in women being abused. This is an irrelevant association which stems from your male malevolency bias. NuclearNight, quite frankly, your reasoning, not your sex, is the real joke.